Peshawar as seen in 1809 from the observations of Mountstuart Elphinstone. Introduction. In the early months of 1809, a Scottish diplomat named Mountstuart Elphinstone led a British mission to the court of Shah Shuja, the King of Caubul, Afghanistan. His journey through the rugged passes of the Hindu Kush and his extended stay in the city of Peshawar produced one of the most detailed and vivid accounts of life in this region during the early 19th century. Elphinstone's narrative, published as an account of the Kingdom of Caubul, offers modern readers an extraordinary window into a world that has long since vanished. A world of Afghan kings, tribal warriors, bustling bazaars, and a city poised at the crossroads of Central Asia, Persia, and India. Peshawar in 1808 to 1809 was a place of remarkable contrasts. It was a city where the splendour of a royal court existed, alongside the constant threat of political instability, where magnificent gardens flourished beneath snow-capped mountains, and where a diverse population of Afghans, Persians, Hindus and tribal peoples mingled in narrow, bustling streets. Elphinstone's observations, free from the political calculations that dominated his official mission, provide an invaluable portrait of a city and its people at a particular moment in history. A moment when the old order was already showing signs of decay, though its outward forms remained impressive. This essay will explore Elphinstone's detailed observations of Peshawar, focusing on three main aspects: the geographical setting that so captivated him, the physical fabric of the city itself, and the rich tapestry of human life that animated its streets and gardens. Through his eyes, we can begin to understand what Peshawar was like in the year 1808 to 1809. Part 1. The geographical setting. A gem set in mountains. The approach to Peshawar. Elphinstone's first glimpse of the Peshawar plain came after a grueling journey through the mountains that separate the Indus River Valley from the Afghan heartland. His description of emerging from the narrow passes into this expansive plain is filled with a sense of wonder and relief. After traversing the terrifying defiles of the Khyber country, where armed tribesmen watched hungrily from the hillsides, the mission finally entered what Elphinstone calls the plain of Peshawar. The contrast could not have been more dramatic. Where the mountain passes had been narrow, dark and dangerous, the plain opened out into a vast basin of extraordinary fertility and beauty. Elphinstone describes it as nearly circular and about 35 miles in diameter, a substantial expanse of level ground surrounded on almost all sides by mountains. Only on the eastern side does the plain open out, providing the route by which Elphinstone had entered and by which he would eventually depart towards the Indus and India. The majestic mountains. The mountains that surround Peshawar are not merely a distant backdrop, but an ever-present feature of the landscape, dominating every view and influencing every aspect of life in the plain. Elphinstone was particularly struck by their grandeur and variety. To the north rose the vast range of snowy mountains that his guides identified as part of the chain of Hindu Kush, the Indian Caucasus. Beyond these peaks, he was told, lay the fabled lands of Kashgar, Badakhshan and Tartary, names that evoked the mysteries of Central Asia. To the southwest, another great peak commanded attention, the peak of Sufadko, or White Mountain, whose name reflected its snow-covered summit. These mountains were not static features of the landscape, but dynamic presences that changed with the light and the seasons. Elphinstone notes how they were often involved in clouds and tempests, while the plain below enjoyed the quiet and sunshine. This contrast between the turbulent heights and the tranquil lowlands became one of his most persistent themes, a visual metaphor for the stability and instability that coexisted in the Kingdom of Caubul itself. The mountains also served as a natural boundary and a source of both protection and threat. They sheltered the plain from the harshest weather, but they also harboured the wild tribes, the Khyberis, the Bariks, and others, who descended from time to plunder caravans and unsettle the peace. Elphinstone's journey through their territories had given him a healthy respect for the dangers they posed, and his description of the mountains always carries an undercurrent of awareness of the human presence within their folds. The rivers and streams. Water was the lifeblood of the Peshawar plain, and Elphinstone devotes considerable attention to the rivers and streams that made its fertility possible. The most important of these was the Caubul River, which entered the plain from the west and divided into 3 branches in the northern part before reuniting to flow eastward towards the Indus. This river, deep, clear and rapid, provided the main drainage for the entire basin and was a constant presence in the landscape. But it was the smaller streams that particularly caught Elphinstone's attention. The rivulets of Bara and Budina, flowing from the mountains to join the Caubul River, created a network of waterways that irrigated the plain and sustained its abundant vegetation. Their banks were fringed with willows and tamarisks, trees that added grace and variety to the landscape while also providing practical benefits: shade, timber, and stabilisation of the riverbanks. The presence of so much water in a region that might otherwise have been arid struck Elphinstone as one of the plain's most remarkable features. He describes how many streams ran through the plain, creating a landscape of extraordinary richness and variety. These streams were not merely utilitarian features, but objects of beauty in their own right, their clear waters reflecting the sky and the surrounding vegetation, their banks providing pleasant walks and resting places, the climate and seasons. Elphinstone's account makes clear that Peshawar enjoyed a climate that was, in his words, delicious. The mission arrived in March, at the very beginning of spring, and he records his observations of the changing seasons with the eye of a naturalist and the appreciation of a traveller long confined to the monotonous heat of India. When they first entered the plain, the upper parts of the surrounding mountains were still covered with snow, while the plain itself was already clothed with the richest verdure. Most of the trees were still bare, but enough were in leaf to give richness and variety to the prospect. As the weeks passed, Elphinstone watched the landscape transform before his eyes. In the course of a fortnight, he writes, the numerous gardens and scattered trees were covered with new foliage, which had a freshness and brilliancy never seen in the perpetual summer of India. This observation is particularly revealing. Elphinstone, like most Europeans in India, had become accustomed to a climate where the distinction between seasons was less marked, where the heat was constant and the vegetation unchanging. In Peshawar, he encountered for the first time in years the familiar rhythm of a temperate spring, the bursting of buds, the flowering of trees, the gradual greening of the landscape. The experience clearly moved him, awakening memories of his native Scotland and providing an emotional connection to this foreign land. The climate also offered practical comforts. The air was cool and pleasant, especially in comparison to the Indian plains from which the mission had come. Even during the rains that plagued their journey through the mountains, the cold, though severe enough to require fur garments, was not accompanied by frost, a fact that Elphinstone notes with some surprise, as if expecting the mountains to be colder than they actually were. The fertility of the plain. If the climate delighted Elphinstone, the fertility of the plain astonished him. He describes it as highly cultivated and irrigated by many watercourses and canals, a landscape transformed by human labour into a garden of remarkable productivity. The greater part of the plain was given over to cultivation, with wheat being the most important crop. Elphinstone's later journey across the plain of Chuch, east of Attock, would reveal fields entirely covered with wheat, and there is every reason to suppose that the Peshawar plain was similarly productive. But it was not merely the staple crops that impressed him. It was the variety and abundance of fruits and flowers that made the region truly exceptional. The orchards scattered across the country contained a profusion of plum, peach, apple, pear, quince, and pomegranate trees. When Elphinstone arrived in March, these trees were putting on a greater display of blossom than I ever before witnessed, a spectacle of colour and fragrance that must have been overwhelming to a traveller from the more austere landscapes of India. Later in the spring, the abundance of roses struck him particularly. Scarcely a beggar or a ragged boy was to be seen, he writes, whose hands were not filled with those flowers. Roses were not merely cultivated in gardens, but seemed to permeate every aspect of life, their beauty and fragrance available even to the poorest inhabitants of the city. The uncultivated parts of the plain were no less remarkable. They were covered with a thick elastic sod that perhaps was never equalled but in England. This comparison to English turf is significant, revealing how deeply Elphinstone's perceptions were shaped by his own background. In the midst of an alien landscape, surrounded by strange peoples and customs, he found comfort in these reminders of home. Green grass beneath his feet, the familiar weeds along the paths, the songbirds that reminded him of English thrushes and blackbirds. The density of population. Perhaps the most surprising feature of the Peshawar plain to a modern reader is its density of population. Elphinstone states emphatically that never was a spot of the same extent better peopled. To support this claim, he cites a remarkable observation by Lieutenant Macartney, one of the mission's officers, who, from a single height, took the bearings of 32 villages, all within a circuit of 4 miles. These villages were not mere clusters of huts, but substantial settlements, generally large and remarkably clean and neat. Almost all were set off with trees, suggesting a settled, prosperous population that took pride in their surroundings. The streams that watered the plain were crossed by little bridges of masonry, each ornamented with 2 small towers at each end, touches of architectural refinement that spoke of a society with leisure and resources to devote to beautifying its environment. This dense population reflected the agricultural wealth of the plain, which could support many people in comfort. But it also reflected the political and social organisation of the region, with its network of tribes and chieftains, each controlling their own territories and villages. Elphinstone's journey through the country had been marked by the presence of local chiefs, each bringing a strong body of militia as we entered his lands, a reminder that this seemingly peaceful landscape was also a patchwork of jurisdictions and loyalties, where power was personal and authority was constantly negotiated. Part 2. The City of Peshawar. A study in contrasts. First impressions. Elphinstone's first view of Peshawar itself came on the morning of February 25th, 1809, when the mission made its formal entry into the city. The approach was anything but dignified. A great crowd lined the roads, covering the banks on each side and climbing trees for a better view. The king's cavalry, sent out to meet the embassy, charged the mob vigorously and used their whips without the least compunction, clearing a path for the procession. Among the horsemen, one figure stood out, a man named Rusul Divana, or Rusul the Mad. Elphinstone describes him in vivid detail, his high red cap of a conical shape with some folds of cloth round the bottom and a white plume, his short jacket of skin, black pantaloons and brown boots. Mounted on a fine grey horse, he carried a long spear without a head, charging at the mob at speed, shouting with a loud and deep voice. This wild figure, at once frightening and impressive, seemed to embody the untamed spirit of the Afghan frontier. As the mission entered the town itself, progress became slow. The streets were narrow, the crowds dense, and Elphinstone had time to hear the remarks of the spectators. These were expressive of wonder at the procession and of goodwill towards us. A welcome contrast to the suspicion and hostility that had greeted news of the embassy in some quarters. The people of Peshawar, it seemed, were curious rather than hostile, eager to see the strange foreigners who had come from across the seas. The size and layout of the city. Peshawar in 1808 to 1809 was a substantial city. Elphinstone estimates its circumference at upwards of 5 miles and its population at about 100,000 inhabitants. These figures, if accurate, would make it a major urban centre by the standards of the time, comparable to many European cities and far larger than most towns in the region. The city stood on an uneven surface, its layout determined more by topography than by any formal plan. The streets were narrow, inevitably so, Elphinstone notes, in a place where no wheeled carriages are used. They were paved, but the pavement sloped down to a central kennel, drain, making them slippery and inconvenient, especially in wet weather. 2 or 3 brooks ran through different parts of the town, their banks skirted with willows and mulberry trees. These streams were crossed by bridges, though Elphinstone found none of them in the least remarkable. The houses themselves were built of brick, generally unburnt brick in wooden frames. They were commonly 3 stories high, with the ground floor typically occupied by shops. This arrangement, common in many traditional cities, created a lively street life while also maximising the use of limited space. The upper stories, reached by internal stairs, provided living quarters for families. Their windows often screened with open woodwork that admitted air and light while preserving privacy. The Bala Hisar. Dominating the city from its northern heights was the Bala Hisar, the castle that served as the king's occasional residence. Elphinstone's description of this fortress is characteristically balanced, noting both its attractions and its weaknesses. The Bala Hisar stood on a hill, commanding a romantic prospect of the city below and the plain beyond. It contained some fine halls and was adorned with very pleasing and spacious gardens. From the north, it presented a commanding aspect, a symbol of royal power visible for miles around. But closer inspection revealed a different story. Viewed from the side nearest the town, the castle disclosed strong signs of weakness and decay. It was, Elphinstone concludes, a castle of no strength, its defences neglected, its fabric crumbling. As the king's residence was only occasional, the court spent much of its time elsewhere. The Bala Hisar had not received the continuous maintenance that a permanent capital would have required. It stood as a monument to past glory rather than a functioning fortress, a reminder that even the most impressive structures could not resist the ravages of time and neglect. This observation of the Bala Hisar becomes for Elphinstone a metaphor for the kingdom itself. Despite moments of splendour, the king's appearance, one blaze of jewels, the magnificent ceremonies, the rich dresses and golden arms, everything bore less the appearance of a state in prosperity than of a splendid monarchy in decay. The castle, like the kingdom, retained the forms of power without its substance, impressive from a distance but crumbling upon closer inspection. The Tekaunas, underground retreats. One of the most distinctive features of Peshawari architecture, and one that particularly fascinated Elphinstone, was the underground cellars known as zirzaminis, or Tekaunas. These were chambers excavated beneath the houses, designed as retreats from the intense heat of summer. Elphinstone describes them in detail. One such cellar, beneath the house where the mission was lodged, was exactly of the same plan and dimensions as the house itself, with the same halls and the same apartments in 2 stories as above ground. This subterranean mansion was lit by broad but low windows near the top. When complete, these cellars were painted and furnished in the same manner as the rooms above, and often featured a fountain in the middle of the main hall. What struck Elphinstone most was the ubiquity of these structures. Even the poor at Peshawar have them under their houses, he notes, though he adds that they were not required in the more temperate climates further west. For the wealthier inhabitants, these underground chambers provided not merely relief from heat, but a space for elegant living, cool and quiet, with the added refinement of flowing water to soothe the senses. Elphinstone himself made good use of his tekhauna during the hot weather, finding it equally agreeable and wholesome. His description suggests a sophisticated understanding of climate-responsive architecture, a tradition of building that had evolved over centuries to make life bearable in a region where summer temperatures could be extreme. The Gardens of Peshawar. If the Teyunas represented the private face of Peshawari life, the gardens represented its public and social face. Elphinstone's descriptions of these gardens are among the most lyrical passages in his entire narrative, revealing a deep appreciation for the beauty that human hands could create when working in harmony with nature. The gardens surrounded the city on all sides, creating a green belt of extraordinary beauty. In the evenings, the mission members would ride out among them, admiring the richness and repose of the landscape, contrasted with the gloomy magnificence of the surrounding mountains. This contrast between the cultivated gardens and the wild mountains beyond became a recurring theme in Elphinstone's appreciation of Peshawar's setting. The gardens themselves were typically embellished with buildings. Mohammedan tombs, with their characteristic cupolas, made a conspicuous figure in the landscape. A lofty and spacious building, ending in several high towers, presented an appearance of grandeur from a distance. A garden house erected by Ali Murdon Khan, a Persian nobleman of legendary taste, stood as a monument to the refined sensibilities that had shaped the region's architecture. But the finest garden of all was that of Shah Zaman, the former king and brother of the reigning monarch. Elphinstone's description of this garden deserves to be quoted at length, for it captures both the physical reality and the emotional impact of these cultivated spaces. The garden was oblong in shape, with the Bala Hisar forming its southern boundary. It was divided into two main parts, a northern section, laid out irregularly and full of trees, and a southern square, formally arranged with avenues crossing in the middle. The east-west avenue was formed by stately rows of alternate cypresses and planes, with 3 parallel walks and 2 long beds of poppies. At the west end stood a handsome house containing a hall and apartments. The north-south avenue was bordered by the same trees, beneath which were planted bushes, planted very thick of red, white, yellow and China roses, white and yellow jasmine, flowering cistus and other flowering shrubs. Some of these Elphinstone recognised from England or India. Others were entirely new to him. Between the walks lay 6 long ponds, arranged so that water fell continually in little cascades from one to another, ending in a basin in the centre of the garden. In the middle of this basin stood a 2-storey summer house, surrounded by fountains. In total, there were 69 fountains, all playing continuously during the day the mission spent at the garden, a remarkable display of hydraulic engineering and aesthetic sensibility. The rest of the garden was filled with fruit trees, the same profusion of plum, peach, apple, pear, quince and pomegranate that characterised the countryside. Some areas were so thickly planted that the sun could not penetrate them at noon, providing a dark, cool and picturesque retreat from the heat of the day. The mission spent a full day at this garden, enjoying its beauties and reading the Persian verses inscribed on its walls. Most of these verses, Elphinstone notes, alluded to the instability of fortune, a theme that must have resonated deeply in a kingdom where kings were deposed and restored with alarming frequency. Some verses, he adds, were very applicable to the king's actual condition, a poignant reminder that even in this earthly paradise, the shadows of politics and fate were never far away. The buildings of the city. Elphinstone's assessment of Peshawar's architecture is surprisingly critical. There are many mosques in the town, he writes, but none of them, or of the other public buildings deserve notice, except the Bala Hisar and the fine caravanserai. This dismissal of the city's religious architecture is striking, especially given the importance of Islam in Afghan society and the wealth that was often lavished on mosques and shrines. The caravanserai, unfortunately, receives no detailed description. We are left to imagine a substantial building, probably arranged around a central courtyard, providing accommodation for the merchants and travellers who made Peshawar a hub of regional trade. Its mention, however brief, reminds us of the city's commercial importance, its position on the trade routes connecting India, Persia and Central Asia. As for the palaces of the great, Elphinstone notes that some were splendid, but adds that few of the nobility have houses here. Peshawar, despite being the king's residence during the mission's stay, was not the permanent capital of the kingdom. The nobility, like the king himself, were often elsewhere, in Caubul, in Kandahar, in Kashmir, and their absence was reflected in the relative modesty of the city's architecture. Peshawar was a place of sojourn rather than a true capital, a fact that shaped both its physical fabric and its social life. Part 3. The People of Peshawar. A Human Tapestry. The Ethnic Mosaic. If the physical city impressed Elphinstone, the human diversity of Peshawar fascinated him. His description of the city's population reads like a catalogue of the peoples of Central and South Asia, each group distinguished by its dress, its customs, and its place in the social order. The inhabitants of Peshawar proper were of Indian origin, but spoke both Pushtu and Hindi. This bilingualism reflected the city's position as a meeting point between the Afghan highlands and the Indian plains, a place where two cultures intertwined and influenced each other. But the core population was only part of the story. During the king's visits, the city swelled with people from all over the region and beyond. Elphinstone enumerates them with the precision of an ethnographer. People of the town in white turbans, some in large white or dark blue frocks, others in sheepskin cloaks. Persians and Afghans in brown woolen tunics or flowing mantles and caps of black sheepskin or coloured silk. Khyberis from the mountains to the west, recognisable by their straw sandals and the wild dress and air of their mountains. Hindus who combined the peculiar features and manners of their own nation with the long beard and the dress of the country. A remarkable synthesis of two distinct cultural traditions. Hazares, perhaps the most exotic to Elphinstone's eyes, distinguished by their conical caps of skin with the wool appearing like a fringe round the edge, their broad faces and little eyes, and most notably, their want of the beard, which is the ornament of every other face in the city. This enumeration reveals a society of extraordinary complexity, where multiple ethnic groups coexisted, each maintaining its distinctive identity while also participating in a shared urban life. The streets of Peshawar were a living museum of Central Asian humanity, a place where observant traveller could study the varieties of human culture without ever leaving the city limits. The street life. Elphinstone's descriptions of street life in Peshawar are among the most vivid passages in his narrative. He and his companions developed a routine of early morning rides, returning to the city as the day's activities reached their peak, and his observations capture the rhythm of urban life with remarkable immediacy. In the early morning before sunrise, the streets were quiet and nearly empty. People assembled at the mosques for their devotions, and after prayers, a few appeared, sweeping the streets before their doors. Great men passed on horseback, preceded by servants on foot who walked pretty fast, but in perfect order and silence. Nothing was heard but the sound of their feet. This was a city still asleep or just beginning to stir, its public spaces given over to the rituals of religion and the quiet preparation for the day ahead. But by the time the mission returned from their rides, the transformation was complete. The streets were crowded with men of all nations and languages, in every variety of dress and appearance. The shops were all open, their wares displayed to attract customers. Elphinstone catalogues the merchandise with the eye of an interested observer. Dried fruits and nuts, bread, meat, boots, shoes, saddlery, bales of cloth, hardware, ready-made clothes and postines, books and so on were either displayed in tiers in front of the shops or hung up on hooks from the roof. The fruiterers' shops were among the handsomest, with apples, melons, plums and even oranges mixed in piles with some of the Indian fruits. The cook shops were equally attractive, their wares served in earthen dishes, painted and glazed so as to look like china, a touch of refinement that elevated the ordinary business of eating into something approaching art. Street vendors added to the bustle, crying their wares, greens, curds and other provisions. Water carriers walked through the crowds, leather bags on their backs, announcing their presence by beating on a brazen cup in which they give a draught to a passenger for a trifling piece of money. These humble tradesmen were as much a part of the urban scene as the wealthy merchants in their shops, their services essential to the functioning of the city. Through this throng moved a constant flow of animals and vehicles. Troops of armed horsemen passed, their approach announced by the clatter of their horses' hoofs on the pavement and by the jingling of their bridles. When the king went out, the streets were choked with horse and foot and dromedaries bearing swivels and large waving red and green flags. At all times, loaded dromedaries or heavy Bactrian camels, covered with shaggy hair, made their way slowly through the streets. Mules, fastened together in circles of 8 or 10, were seen off the road going round and round to cool them after their labour, while their keepers were indulging at an eating house or enjoying a smoke of a hired kaloon in the street. Amidst all this activity, the mission members themselves attracted varying degrees of attention. Usually they passed without any notice, except a salam alaikum from a passenger, accompanied by a bow, with the hands crossed in front. Sometimes a beggar would approach, calling out for relief from the Ferengi Khans, European lords, reminding them that life was short and the benefit of charity immortal. Occasionally, a boy would spot them from a window, his shout of "Up Ferengi," bringing all the women and children in the house to stare at us till we were out of sight. These observations reveal much about the place of foreigners in Peshawari society. The mission members were objects of curiosity, certainly, but not of hostility. They moved through the streets with relative ease, their presence accepted as part of the rich diversity of urban life. The city's inhabitants had clearly seen strangers before, merchants from Persia, pilgrims from India, envoys from distant courts, and the arrival of Europeans, while unusual, was not unprecedented. The character of the people. Beyond their external appearance, Elphinstone offers insights into the character and customs of the people he encountered. His observations are generally favourable, revealing a population that was civil, hospitable, and curious about the world beyond their borders. The country people, in particular, impressed him with their courtesy. Nothing could exceed the civility of the country people, he writes. They were often invited into gardens and welcomed in every village by almost every man that saw us. Villagers would frequently entreat the gentlemen of the embassy to allow them the honour of being their hosts, sometimes even laying hold of their bridles and refusing to let them pass until they had promised to breakfast with them on some future day. These promises were confirmed by putting their hands between theirs, a gesture that Elphinstone clearly understood as a form of sacred oath binding the parties to their agreement. This hospitality extended to all levels of society. Even the poorest villagers, it seems, were eager to offer what they could to the strangers in their midst. Elphinstone's narrative is notably free of the complaints about beggars and importunate natives that fill so many European travel accounts of the period. When he does mention beggars, it is usually in the context of their religious sentiments, their reminders of the benefit of charity immortal, rather than their annoyance to travellers. The townspeople, while perhaps more worldly and less spontaneously hospitable than their rural counterparts, were equally civil in their dealings with the mission. The crowds that gathered to watch their procession were expressive of wonder and of goodwill. The merchants in the bazaars went about their business without apparent concern for the foreigners in their midst. The great men who visited the mission or received its members in their own houses were, for the most part, agreeable and conversable people from whom much local information was to be gained. One aspect of Peshawari character that did trouble Elphinstone was the greed for presents that he observed among all but the highest classes. "A number of persons followed us from the city," he notes on one occasion, "some to show their attention, but more to importune us for presents, of which all the people at Peshawar, except the highest classes, were inordinately greedy." This appetite for gifts was not unique to Peshawar. Elphinstone had encountered it elsewhere in his travels, but it seems to have been particularly pronounced here, perhaps because the city's position on trade routes had accustomed its inhabitants to the opportunities for profit that strangers represented. The women of Peshawar. Elphinstone's observations on women are necessarily limited, given the restrictions on contact between unrelated men and women in Muslim society. What he does record, however, is revealing. Women appeared in public only rarely, and when they did, they were with long white veils that reached their feet, garments that concealed their forms and faces from public view. This was the expected practice in a society that valued female modesty and seclusion, and Elphinstone notes it without comment. More interesting are his observations of women in domestic settings. As the mission passed beneath the town of Calabar before reaching Peshawar, they perceived windows and balconies at a great height, crowded with women and children. These women, presumably, were the inhabitants of the houses, watching the strange procession pass below, a glimpse of domestic life that was otherwise hidden from view. Similarly, when a boy's shout brought all the women and children in the house to stare at us till we were out of sight, we catch a brief glimpse of the curiosity that women, no less than men, felt about the strangers in their midst. Confined to their homes, they could only observe from windows and rooftops, their presence in the city's life silent and invisible, but nonetheless real. The learned and the holy. Peshawar in 1808 to 1809 was not merely a city of merchants and soldiers. It was also a centre of learning and religion, home to scholars, saints, and seekers after truth. Elphinstone's encounters with some of these figures add another dimension to his portrait of the city. The mission received many visitors, and among them were numerous mullahs, learned men versed in theology, law, and the sciences. Elphinstone categorises them with the eye of a connoisseur. Some learned and some worldly, some deists, others rigid Mohammedans, and some overflowing with the mystical doctrines of the Sufis. This diversity of religious and philosophical opinion suggests an intellectual culture of considerable sophistication, where different schools of thought coexisted and competed for adherence. Two individuals stand out in Elphinstone's account. Mirza Ghuram Khan, the son of a Persian nobleman, had spent time in India and had observed English customs with great attention and acuteness. His knowledge of European affairs was surprising when Elphinstone mentioned that there had been no rebellion in England since 1745. Mirza Ghuram quietly reminded him of the American War, a correction that reveals both his knowledge and his tact. This gentleman later became Munshi Baushi, or Secretary of State at Caubul, a position that would have allowed him to put his knowledge of the world to practical use. Even more remarkable was Mullah Berramont, described by Elphinstone as a man of retired and studious habits, but really a man of genius and of insatiable thirst for knowledge. Though well versed in the traditional Islamic sciences, metaphysics, ethics and the like, his passion was for mathematics. He was, astonishingly, studying Sanskrit, a language of which none of his countrymen know the name, in the hope of discovering the treasures of Hindu learning. This intellectual curiosity, crossing religious and cultural boundaries, speaks to a scholarly tradition that was more open and syncretic than we might expect. Poets also frequented the mission, coming with panegyrics on the Ilchi, ambassador, and other Quonini Fereng, European khans. These poets would follow up their addresses with endless quotations and specimens of their own works, a practice that Elphinstone, with his classical education, could appreciate even if the language was unfamiliar. Beyond the learned men of the city, there were also holy men, saints and dervishes whose renunciation of the world gave them a special status in society. Elphinstone's visit to Sheikh Iwuz, a celebrated saint, is particularly revealing. The sheikh was found not in a splendid shrine, but in a little garden, dressed like a labourer, appearing to have been digging in the earth. Men of high rank stood at a distance out of respect, while the sheikh made his visitors sit down upon the clods which had just been turned up, and conversed very agreeably on all subjects except religion. The sheikh's conversation revealed a sharp wit and a critical view of his society. He had heard that the people of Peshawar had been mean enough to importune me for presents, and declared that the Afghan chiefs had become such a set of scoundrels that he was ashamed of them. He praised the king, however, and showed no affectation of holiness beyond his simple dress and manner. When he lamented having nothing to offer his guests and proposed sending to a cookshop for a dinner, Elphinstone recognised a genuine humility that was itself a form of sanctity. Another dervish declined Elphinstone's visit altogether, saying that he had renounced the world and was entirely engaged in prayer and meditation. When Elphinstone sent him a large sum of money for charity, he peremptorily refused it, though he prayed for the king and the ambassador and sent a grateful message. This refusal of worldly wealth, even for charitable purposes, represented a stricter interpretation of the ascetic ideal than the more worldly Sheikh Iwuz had exemplified. These encounters reveal a society where religion was not merely a matter of formal observance, but a living tradition, capable of producing both the engaged saint who criticised the powerful and the solitary mystic who rejected all contact with the world. The presence of such figures in and around Peshawar added a spiritual dimension to the city's life, reminding its inhabitants that there were values beyond commerce and politics. The dangers of urban life. For all its civility and diversity, Peshawar in 1808 to 1809 was not a place of perfect safety. The political instability that plagued the kingdom had its effects on the city, and even in ordinary times, the presence of armed men and the proximity of wild tribes created an undercurrent of danger. Elphinstone's narrative contains several reminders of this reality. When a rumour spread that he was plotting with the king's enemies, the whole town was in a ferment. People were running up and down in all directions, getting their arms in order and lighting their matches, and a great mob soon assembled at our gates. Only the timely arrival of a friendly minister dispersed the crowd and restored calm. Later, as the mission prepared to leave Peshawar, the country became a little unsettled. Instead of the occasional footpads who had previously targeted lone travellers, there were now bands of robbers who carried off several loaded camels. The accountant of the mission lost a mule loaded with £1,000 worth of rupees and fine shawls, the animal having thrown its rider and shaken off its burden, which was instantly pillaged by the bystanders. These incidents reveal the fragility of order in a society where central authority was weak and local loyalties were strong. The same people who welcomed strangers with civility and offered them hospitality could, in different circumstances, become a mob or a band of robbers. The line between hospitality and predation was thin, and the traveller who forgot this fact did so at his peril. Part 4. The Seasons and Their Pleasures. Spring in Peshawar. The mission's stay in Peshawar spanned the spring and early summer of 1809, and Elphinstone's observations capture the changing face of the city and its surroundings as the seasons advanced. Spring was a time of extraordinary beauty. The mountains still wore their crowns of snow, but the plain below was already clothed with the richest verdure. The trees, bare upon the mission's arrival, quickly burst into leaf, and the orchards put on their magnificent display of blossom. The streams ran full and clear, their banks green with new growth. The climate was delicious, a word Elphinstone uses repeatedly to convey his appreciation of the temperate weather. The gardens were at their best during this season. The roses for which Peshawar was famous began to bloom, their abundance such that even the poorest inhabitants could fill their hands with flowers. Elphinstone's description of Shah Zaman's garden, with its fountains playing and its trees in full leaf, captures the perfection of a Peshawari spring, a moment of beauty and tranquility that must have seemed all the more precious given the political turmoil that surrounded it. The approach of summer. As spring gave way to early summer, the character of the place began to change. The weather grew warmer, and the underground cellars, the tekaunas, became essential retreats from the heat. Elphinstone, who had found his cellar agreeable and wholesome during the hot weather, clearly appreciated this architectural solution to the challenges of climate. The long days of June brought another novelty: the duration of twilight. On June 16th, Elphinstone notes with surprise that day broke at 3:15, and the sun did not rise till within 10 minutes of 5. This prolonged dawn, and presumably a correspondingly prolonged dusk, was novel to a traveller from India, where the transition between night and day was more rapid. The approach of summer also brought the monsoon rains, which reached as far as Peshawar and its environs. At Hassan Abdul, the last major halt before the mission left Afghan territory, Elphinstone notes that the influence of the rains of Hindustan, which now began to reach us, had cooled the air and given it a peculiar softness and pleasantness. This softening of the climate, coming after the heat of early summer, must have been a welcome relief. The constant presence of nature. Throughout his description of Peshawar, Elphinstone emphasises the constant presence of nature within and around the city. The streams that ran through the town, their banks lined with willows and mulberries, brought the countryside into the urban fabric. The gardens that surrounded the city created a green belt that blurred the boundary between town and country. The mountains, visible from every vantage point, reminded inhabitants and visitors alike of the wild world beyond the cultivated plain. This integration of nature and culture was one of Peshawar's chief charms for Elphinstone. In India, he had become accustomed to a sharper division between the human and natural worlds. The cultivated plains sharply demarcated from the jungles and wastes. In Peshawar, the two interpenetrated in ways that reminded him of England, where fields and woods and villages formed a continuous tapestry of human and natural life. The presence of familiar plants and birds reinforced this impression. The gardens contained clover, chickweed, plantains, ribgrass, dandelions, common dock and many other English weeds, plants that Elphinstone had not seen since leaving his homeland. The song of birds that reminded some of his companions of thrushes and blackbirds added an auditory dimension to this sense of familiarity. In the midst of an alien culture, surrounded by strange languages and customs, these reminders of home provided comfort and connection. Conclusion. Peshawar in 1808 to 1809, a city remembered. Mountstuart Elphinstone's account of Peshawar offers us a window into a world that has long since vanished. The city he described, with its 100,000 inhabitants, its bustling bazaars, its magnificent gardens, its diverse population of Afghans, Persians, Hindus, and tribal peoples, was a product of its time and place, shaped by centuries of history and poised on the brink of transformative change. What emerges most strongly from Elphinstone's observations is the city's character as a place of contrasts. It was a city of extraordinary natural beauty, set in a fertile plain surrounded by majestic mountains. Yet it was also a place of political instability and occasional violence. It was a centre of royal power, where kings held court in splendid ceremonies. Yet it bore less the appearance of a state in prosperity than of a splendid monarchy in decay. It was a crossroads of cultures, where peoples from across Asia mingled in the streets, yet it maintained distinct ethnic and social boundaries that structured daily life. The people of Peshawar, as Elphinstone describes them, were similarly complex. They were civil and hospitable, welcoming strangers into their gardens and villages, yet they could also be inordinately greedy for presents and quick to turn to violence when order broke down. They were deeply religious, supporting saints and dervishes and filling their mosques for prayers, yet they tolerated a remarkable diversity of religious opinion, from rigid Mohammedans to deists to mystical Sufis. They were rooted in their own traditions, yet curious about the wider world, as evidenced by Mirza Gharami's knowledge of European affairs and Mullah Behramand's study of Sanskrit. For Elphinstone himself, Peshawar was clearly a place of profound impression. His descriptions are those of a man who observed carefully and felt deeply, who could appreciate both the beauty of a garden and the complexity of a society. The city stayed with him long after he left, its images and memories informing his understanding of Afghanistan and its people. Today, Peshawar is a very different place. 2 centuries of history, the rise and fall of empires, the coming of modernity, the conflicts of the 20th and 21st centuries have transformed the city beyond recognition. The Bala Hissar, already decaying in Elphinstone's time, has undergone many changes. The gardens, if they survive at all, are shadows of their former selves. The population has grown many times over, and the ethnic composition has shifted with the tides of history. Yet Elphinstone's account remains valuable, not merely as a historical record, but as a testament to the enduring human qualities that define a place. The hospitality he encountered, the diversity he observed, the beauty he appreciated. These are not merely features of a particular moment in time, but aspects of a civilization that has persisted through centuries of change. In reading his account, we come closer to understanding not only what Peshawar was in 1808 to 1809, but what it has been and what it might yet be in the long story of human habitation at this crossroads of Asia. The Peshawar that Elphinstone knew was, in many ways, a world unto itself, a city set in a fertile plain, surrounded by mountains, populated by a diverse and vibrant people. It was a place where splendour and decay coexisted, where hospitality and danger were 2 sides of the same coin, where the beauty of nature and the works of humans combined to create something unique and memorable. Thanks to his careful observations and vivid descriptions, that Peshawar lives on, a city of the past that continues to inform our understanding of the present, a reminder of the richness and complexity of human life in all times and places.